So
Now you have to behave.
I guess I start yelling.
Two professors.
Good afternoon. My name is Hans-Helmut Kotz. I'm a resident fellow here at the Center for European Studies and have the great pleasure and joy to introduce a really interesting panel on an issue which is most topical in Europe, actually for years now. So we gave this panel the title, Europe Between a Rock and a Hard Place, and we weren't clear what rock or hard place would be, so we found some sort of substitutes in terms of China and the US. With China and the US conducting policies which have been called industrial policies on a very significant scale, giving incentives also to European firms to do what the French would call délocalisation, which in that case means very precisely that European firms are thinking about relocating from Europe to China and the US, to the US as a result, for instance, of subsidies they can receive when the Inflation Reduction Act is applied. And for China, because of this is just a very big market. Often we talk about these issues in terms of a macroeconomic dimension. And then, by the way, it doesn't seem, the dependence of European nation states doesn't seem that big. But if you go down to the level of sectors, or even go down to the level of firms, you end up with some of those firms having almost half of their revenues out of China. So this is an issue which comes with lots of potential reverberations and also pretty much political consequences. And that's what we would like to talk about this afternoon. We will start off with a former twice commissioner of the European Union, Cecilia Malmström. She was before that actually a member of the European Parliament, so she has a real experience in all the bickering at nation-state level and at the EU level. And she's supposed to answer two questions. Cecilia, here's the floor.
Thank you very much, Hans-Helmut. Good afternoon to everybody. It's a real pleasure being here. And we're going to talk about different aspects, as you said, and I will talk about European defense and how to pay for it. And of course, this is something that has come up, well, it's a debate that has been going on for quite some time in Europe. But of course, with the terrible Russian invasion of Ukraine, the civilian disaster and the threat to the whole European global order, this has become much more acute lately. Also, discussions on how to continue to help and finance Ukraine's defense, and also the increasing pressure from Europe to play a bigger role in NATO. So it all plays into all this. Now, of course, the member countries of the European Union are almost all suffering from slow growth and fragile budgets. They need to keep budget deficits and public debts under strict controls. There are common rules for this and also national requirements. They are then struggling domestically with all the needs that they need to give the citizens. But of course, there are also European needs that we need to finance collectively. You might have heard about the different reports that have been popping up lately to underline how Europe is lagging behind when it comes to innovation, competitiveness, economic growth. The most famous one is the report by Professor Draghi, who was head of the ECB before, and he just recently published a report which is quite alarming and with lots of different suggestions on what to do in the European Union. And he recommends hundreds of recommendations. I will not go through them. But he said that there are 3 areas. There's the innovation gap that needs to be closed. There is the way to combine decarbonization and competitiveness. And then we have the huge challenge of security and reduce our dependence, both on others, but also, for instance, on raw materials, which is a security problem. So if we focus on the defense, the main problem today in the EU is that the defense industry is very fragmented, it lacks common standards, it lacks interoperability. And the fragmentation of the defense market is very costly. There was a report recently saying that the EU loses an average of 100 billion euros, which is almost the same in dollars, annually, because it's not coordinated. So only there you could gain a lot. Then we have, of course, the autonomy issue, that Europe is very dependent on the US in NATO, but also now in relation to Ukraine. We have the growing geopolitical threats from the world, not only Russia, but a hostile world. We have limited investment in defense research and in innovation, and we have difficulties accessing both public and private investment. So what needs to be done? Well, you need to fix all this. And there has been different strategies, different proposals, there are different funds where members can apply to sort of reinforce research, development, capacities, etc. But all this costs money. And right now, as you might know, the European Union is in a little bit of a transition period. We're waiting for the new Commission to be installed. On Monday, there will be the launch of the hearings of the commissioners nominated, the 26, because the President, Ursula von der Leyen, is already confirmed. And after that hearing, and if it all goes well, hopefully a new commission can be in place the 1st of December. And one of the first things this commission will need to do is to prepare for the long-term budget. We have annual budget, but we also have a long-term budget called the multi-financial perspective. And that runs until 27, but it has to be negotiated with all the member states and the European Parliament. It's quite a tough challenge. And of course, all this that I mentioned and everything else that I didn't mention related to enlargement and cohesion, agriculture, and so on, will need to fit in that budget. So there's always already a first proposal, but then the defense needs to come into that. So countries need, of course, to meet their NATO targets, 2%. 2/3 do that in the European Union, so that is not enough. And if they were to meet the targets by the end of the year, this will not happen, but just as an example, that would mean increased defense spending by 60 billion euros. That's a lot of money that member states can put into their defense, which is beneficial for NATO and, of course, for Europe and national. And there are discussions within Europe and with NATO. There was a meeting yesterday between the head of the Commission and the new Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, to launch a working group on how to reinforce and strengthen EU-NATO cooperation, because it is clear that the European dimension of NATO needs to be strengthened, but there is no real debate, but we can talk about this if you want, about something in parallel or having a European NATO or so, but it has to be strengthened, the European pillar within NATO. So there are different funds and different ways to address this. And the European Commission has, for the first time ever, appointed a specific commissioner responsible for defense. And this is interesting because defense is national responsibility. But what the Commission can do and will do is to try to coordinate and to see what can be done in order to increase interoperability, to see how we can increase the financing and so on. So this commissioner appointed, but not yet in office, Andrius Kubilius, his first task will be to present within 100 days a white paper on European defense, framing a new approach to defense and investments. There will be a procurement act for defense material and an act in support of ammunition production. And he will have to identify how to incentivize public and private investment. And this is going to be done under the very catchy line, Europe must spend more, spend better, spend European. Yesterday, there was also a report presented that has been commanded or asked for by the European Commission by former Finnish President Niinistö. He presented that yesterday. It's interesting reading. He also says that the European of the new European budget, 20% has to be dedicated to defense, and defense in a broad sense, also civil preparedness for different disasters and catastrophes, etc. So all this is now on the table. Draghi has proposed, and many countries support this, but not all, that the EU should set up a specific fund in order to fund innovation and to fund the new defense spending. We did that just after Corona, a special Corona fund, where the European Union took loans on the international market jointly, with joint guarantees, in order to finance that. So the proposal is to do something similar to finance innovation in general, and specifically for defense. That would then pool the resources and share the burden. If you issue bonds collectively, you get them at a lower cost. This has judicial complications that can be solved. You need a clear and transparent framework. You need probably to change the EU debt rules. There are fiscal rules that countries have when it comes to their deficits. There are proposals, mainly from Poland, that they should be weakening up. So if you have deficits that are related to defense instruments, you would not be punished. That's a problem as well. And there is a political problem with this. Some member countries have said definitely no, this is not going to happen.
They said 9.
9, they said, yes. But behind the 9, there were a few other no's that were a little bit more discreet, but nevertheless very forceful. I think such a fund would be ideal, but it's not going to happen shortly. There's not enough support for that. We see growing opposition within different political parties in the European Union as well, who are opposed to financing Ukraine, who are in favor of peace, as they say, meaning we should let Russia win this war. And there is also a lack of trust between the member states on how such funds would be used, because the COVID fund, or the Next Generation Europe Fund, as it is called formally, has not really been evaluated yet. So I don't think a fund like that will happen shortly, but there are a lot of things that can be done. Some will cost money, they will have to be increased in the budget, there will have to be increased national expenditure within the NATO, and there's a lot of things that can be done by efficiency and more coordination as well. It's going to be tricky, but with political will, it can be done. And paradoxically, maybe if Trump wins the election, it could push Europe to further action and quicker action. It has been done before, and it can be done now. And as all of you who study European Union history and integration theory, you know that external threats are very efficient to push Europe forward. So between a rock and a hard place, I think things will happen, but it will be gradual. I stop there.
Cecilia was about to steal the notion which I was about to use.
Okay.
Monet. Europe is forged in crisis. And actually, most of the really deep, innovative and structural reforms which we saw were always in response to one or two big accidents. Banking union, for example, was suggested right from the beginning. In the early 1990s, it was criticized by almost all economists who were assessing the ideas about the creation of the monetary union, and there was a big majority of economists saying Europe is bank-based. If you want to do a monetary union, you have to do a banking union. Of course, it did not happen until we saw the euro crisis. So since 2014, we have now a single supervisory mechanism. But I don't want to derail our debate. Europe needs crisis. Sarah Guillou has been working on industrial policy from a quite French perspective for a long time. She has published a really great book last year with Duno on industrial policy. And I asked her to take a French position. We are all prejudiced, you know?
Yeah, but I'm a European too.
We all are.
Okay.
And this is why we are here. So I have to say that next year it's 2025, so the EU is going to enter the next quarter of the 21st century, and I think Europe is at the crossroad, has to count with probably less America, and less China. It's better like this?
Yeah.
Yes. Of course, the US is going to be kept absorbed by its own division, and China is going to be absorbed by its own problems, own economic problems. So, and the EU has to be much more absorbed by its own fate and its own destiny. Europe has experienced a lot of problems, and since the pandemic, or even since the debt crisis, because there was the economic crisis of 2008, but also much more important for the EU, the debt crisis. And there's a kind of Euro bashing since then. The EU is not capable of dealing commonly with the pandemic. The EU is incapable of anticipating the aggressivity of Russia. It's incapable to be independent in terms of energy. It is weak to provide military aid to Ukraine without the US. It could be too weak also to fight Trump administration. So there's a kind of European bashing. But I think that Europe, as you said, in a sense, is always capable of defy the odds and fight this threat, and probably has to be much more put more energy in its own hands for the future. Because the EU is a trade power, it's a regulatory power, Brussels effect, a purchasing power, a big market, a scientific power, and a welfare power. In terms of health, social goods, security, it's good to live in Europe. And we were talking about aging population, of course, but it's better to be old if you are in Europe than anywhere in the world. So it's not a way to attract old people to come to EU, but of course, it's not a geopolitical power. It's not a tech power. It's not an innovative power, more or less. It is weak on education, on tech patents, and it is suffering where it used to have strong comparative advantage, like in energy, in automotive industry, and even in space today. It's not anymore as strong as before. Well, the EU is still strong in rails, shipbuilding, containers, airplanes. You see the problem with Boeing. We are very happy with Airbus. And used to be strong in communication and finance, also, banking. And now is also suffering because of this lack of integration, the so weighted union of capital markets. So the question is whether facing these weaknesses, providing subsidies as it is done in China or in the US will be the solution. So do we need such an industrial policy with a lot of subsidies? Do we have the capacity? We do have a regulation of state aids that is quite strict, but at the same time, France and Germany are good provider of state aid to their companies. And we do have also the tools to pull some investment in certain technology, like it is possible with this important project of common interest, European interest, the IPCEs. So we pull investment and money and capital into hydrogen, semiconductors, batteries, and cloud computing. Would it be enough? Could it be sufficient to enhance the comparative advantage of the EU? Of course, we are lacking, as it is well shown by the Draghi report, we are lacking of private investment, not only of public investment, but of private investment. And there are many reasons for that. Not only because we are not positioned on these technology sectors which invest a lot today, because the main bulk of investment are done by, in R&D and so on, are done by the tech big firms, and we are lacking such big firms in the EU to push the investment ahead. So yes, there are some things that has to be done in the EU, but I don't think that the best answer would be a race to subsidy, a race with China and the US. We can do better, I think. We are a trade power, and we should use this as a way to shape and continue to bet on multilateralism, but at least also on the trade agreements that we can have with many other places in the world. So I think there are common values in Europe across members. We have difficulties, institutional difficulties in the way we decide at the EU level, as we said previously. We have big economies that are making the economy of the EU, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and more. But the decision is taken by one member, one vote. So the decision is not in coherence with the economic power. So that's why there is kind of discrepancy that makes it difficult to push right economic policies. Well, what can we do? If I knew, probably I won't be there. So I don't know exactly what is the good recipe for the EU for the next quarter. But I guess that what's going to happen in the next year is probably will push the EU to change its view on how on the international order. I think the EU has to stop to trust its traditional allies. It has to stop to trust Russia, to stop to trust China, specifically Germans. It has to stop to think that the US will always be there, and it has to trust in its own fate for the future. And stop thinking also that the world is working in a cooperative way. The Commission is not an international institution. And because if you are an international institution, you have to build on cooperation, you have to believe in cooperative behaviors. But the Commission is not an international institution. It is the executive power of the European Union, and it has to change its way of thinking for the future.
Thank you very much, Sarah. You outlined a view on industrial policy, which is possibly one which could be shared at a European level, but is not necessarily shared in your own country.
Right, as in many countries, actually. Today, it was also shown previously in the afternoon that we are lacking leadership in many countries. Mm-hmm. And that's true in France as well also. So yes, there are, there is a tradition that in France in favor of economic intervention. So that's a kind of a common value that cross all the parties.
Colbertisme.
Yes, yeah, so that's historical reference to Colbert. Yes, there is this tradition, but at the same time, France is more and more completely embedded in the EU and the way and the rules of the European Union, and has to to comply with the state aid rules, with the competition policy. And so I think now France is much more shaped in the way the EU is working. And probably, I think the influence of France to push into industrial policy at the EU level is also good for just change the way we think at the EU level.
One French idea, and Adam, the co-organizer of this, I would like to respond to that. Adam and his institute is, by the way, one of the last flag bearers of multilateralism and free cross-border trade, untrammeled. There's this idea about strategic autonomy, and in order to become resilient, to be self-sufficient in many domains. What's your view on that?
Thank you very much.
I haven't really properly introduced you.
That's
You're
okay.
president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and possibly even more importantly, he was for quite a while a decision maker in monetary policy as a member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England.
So, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Hans-Helmut, for 30 years of friendship, for partnering the Center for European Studies with Peterson Institute on this initiative, and thanks to all of you who came out. It's my first time back at Harvard since before COVID, and I'm very gratified. So many people I learned from so much through the years are here today: Ben Friedman, Peter Hall, Karl Kaiser, and others. I'm going to be coming directly out of some things Sarah said, but I think coming out both a little more optimistic and definitely on the other side of the strategic autonomy issue. I think the title that Hans-Helmut suggested that we agreed on about between a rock and a hard place for Europe, I think it's right, but I also think it's misleading about Europe's options. When you're between a rock and a hard place, sometimes the best idea is to move. And I think there is a tendency in some interpretations of the Draghi report, in some political discussions at the Commission level, and some of the discussions we're having now, to think that the Europeans have to, even if reluctantly, play the American and the Chinese game, try to match them at least in part on industrial policy and subsidies, be somewhat more aggressive towards China than it's been, and so on. And my view is that's a foolish errand by the Europeans. The Europeans cannot, for a variety of reasons, including some that Cecilia mentioned, cannot hope to match the US or China in terms of industrial subsidies, or for that matter, bullying trading partners. The main thing that Europe has, building on some things that Sarah said and that we spoke about in a workshop earlier today, is that it not only has the single market, it has values of openness and engagement with the rest of the world that are attractive and that will be increasingly rare in a world where China and the US are in greater and greater economic conflict. So it makes sense to me, I'll go from the abstract to the practical in a moment, but that Europe should be, instead of trying to play the game that China and the US are playing, play a completely different game. And that is to open up, not just in trade, but to suck in as much as possible of the foreign direct investment, talent, financial investment, two-way flows to developing economies, and so on, that Europe and China, US and China, will either be foregoing through their protectionist policies or will be driving away through their bullying policies. And I think this is much more viable than some people think. I know it is much more lucrative in an economic way, but also I would argue in a security way than trying to be their own version of China or the US. The biggest issue, to start on an economic point, is that we've seen repeatedly, and we're seeing now in the US and China, the real gains don't come from the production of technology. The real gains come from the use of technology. And we saw this in the 90s when the US leapt ahead, and particularly if you're a follower of the Draghi Bible on productivity growth, it was because the US made changes throughout its economy in a decentralized way. Corporations, institutions adopted and adapted to the new technologies of information and the internet. Whereas we have people obsessing over whether Germany is no longer producing solar panels. And solar panels are frankly the transistor radios of today with unfortunate installation costs. They're basically a low-value added, low-tech commodity product. And so, which leads into the second point, that Europe stands to advantage itself as well as the world, there is no conflict here, by accelerating its green transformation. And the more it is willing to take in technology, green technology from low-cost producers like China in EV and solar, just to cite two examples, but most importantly, probably batteries, it will get ahead. And with the CBAM process and other things which Cecilia and others could speak to, that allows them to set higher and higher standards that they can use for bargaining in the world. The third point going in this direction is that I think you should think of this as both low-hanging fruit and perennial fruit. The low-hanging fruit I've already sort of mentioned. Anytime the U.S. unilaterally decides it's going to put sanctions or restrictions on a given economy, that of course is hindering to its own headquartered companies. You lose market share, you lose also price competitiveness in other industries that take in the inputs directly or indirectly. And Europe can, of course, avoid all that and gain at the US's expense. In a sense, it's similar to Vietnam or Mexico gaining from the shift of production out of China. They're at the lower end of the income spectrum where Europe is not. It's much more about the production jobs and the spillovers that come with it. This extends to a wide range of areas, including if the U.S., and I hate to say this at Harvard, but if the U.S. is excluding STEM students from China in the hundreds of thousands because it's worried about spying, let Ludwig Maximilian Universität in München and a dozen polytechniques in France and others pull in the best students from China and so on. There are just a number of ways. Foreign direct investment in particular is a place where both directions, if the U.S. is increasingly unwilling to invest abroad because they don't want to transfer technology, everything has to be produced at home, let Europe do that and gain from it. Now, some people, particularly in Washington, if I offer this point of view, and I've tried it in both Berlin and Washington and other places and now here, say, on the one hand, I'm horribly naive, that the Americans and the Chinese will not let Europe do this. And I think that is actually self-delusional because as we've seen, and a colleague of mine at the Peterson Institute, Martin Trzempo, spoke earlier today, has documented, even in places where the U.S. has extreme control over a large number of technologies, extreme focus on choke points, for example, with the semiconductor chips industry at the high end right now, they are unable to prevent European companies like ASML from continuing to trade with China. They are unable to prevent even Taiwanese and Korean companies who have a much more proximate security threat from China and much more security dependence. So in a sense, it's only a boogeyman whose bluff can be called. Additionally, oh dear, we've driven people out, oh well. Additionally, I think the important point is sometimes European leaders, I should not refer to Europe as reify in aggregate, sometimes European leaders tend to think what they do has a very big effect on U.S. foreign policy, and I think that is also mistaken. That there is a sense that they do not want to lose American support for military action in Ukraine. And I can well understand why they care about that. But I don't believe that the European economic conduct vis-a-vis China is a determinant of that. The U.S. will or will not support military action in Ukraine depending on who's president because of their views on Putin, Russia, and military deterrence. It's not some finely calibrated exercise where if the Europeans are just not quite nice enough the Americans will change their mind. Now, Trump may choose to put it that way, but we should not be misled by that. I can go on in this way for a while, but let me try to bring this to a reasonable conclusion. It may sound like I'm offering platitudes, but it's actually, I think, very telling that essentially no one in Europe at the present is advocating this kind of work, except Cecilia and a few others. But then they don't, even then it's not as a strategy. It's as, oh, well, we are doing some things to get EU in agreement with Mercosur on trade, or we are doing some things to push back at the Americans on sanctions in a given area. But I think it would be wise, not just economically, but diplomatically, for Europe to make this an actual stated strategy, particularly in a world where, in part due to the Ukraine war, but much more due to other long-term factors, a large part of the developing world is increasingly frustrated with both the US and China. But they still need a large market, a set of high-income countries with high technology and high standards to help them economically through mutual beneficial trade and investment. And Europe can take the lion's share of that and gain diplomatically while doing so. So you can get out from the rock and the hard place. Try it.
Thank you very much, Adam. I find the point you made on mutually beneficial trade really important, because if you engage in trade, you necessarily make yourself dependent. And trying to get rid of all dependencies, i.e. trying to become self-sufficient, buy German, buy Lower Saxony, is, under standard assumption, massively welfare decreasing. The idea of this panel was actually that we would have some introductory remarks, and then we would like to have the audience participating as much as possible. So I would really like some of you showing his or her hand and joining. Stefan, du kommst als Letzter. And
I see somebody over there.
or I'm threatening to come up with my own questions.
No.
That was a threat. Yes, please.
Well, you've argued, I think, collectively for more European integration to both, attract and get economies of scale on public investment, but also maybe providing a more gravity for attracting private investment. And I wonder if one of the solutions is some form of union. You mentioned a banking union, maybe a legal union. I think Enrico Letta a few days ago mentioned it on French radio about introducing a 28th virtual state that would have common SME regulation. And so would the end goal be some kind of fiscal union and fiscal coordination? I just want to hear some thoughts on that, maybe.
Yeah, I'll start. Speaking as an economist of sorts, the gap, the lack of fiscal union is, I think, much more serious than people used to realize. I mean, the late Peter Kennan, to his credit, pointed out that lack of fiscal union was really the Achilles heel of European monetary unification, and some stuff I did and Jean Pisani-Ferry and others have worked on, and Paul Krugman and others have Paul de Grave. I mean, we all went down that line. So even before we got to here, the argument for greater European fiscal capacity, greater European common issuance of debt, greater European expenditure on common projects was already evident. But there clearly is a very strong revealed political preference against that, right? So whether that political preference is in some sense legitimate or widely held, or that's above my pay grade. But revealed preferences, we're not getting there. And so the Draghi report can be invoked in favor of that. The Draghi report can be invoked in favor of almost anything. It's like the Bible. It will be quoted to justify any position from now on. So I think, to be realistic, one has to think of other ways to move forward. And so part of the motivation for my proposals is that they are things that are totally within the current European competence and would have beneficial effects, but do not require much, if anything, in the way of common European expenditure. So I see the logic of your argument, but that I don't see happening in the near term. I would be very glad to be wrong.
Olivia, did you?
None of you spoke explicitly, at least, about labor markets. If technology adoption is to be like anything, that the more positive version of what you spoke about is to happen, even if industry structure remains similar. To my estimation, the degree of labor dynamism and the number of occupational transitions will have to occur at a rate that far outstrips at least the recent past in Europe. And then even more so if industry structure is going to shift. For example, will auto continue to have the place within the German economy it has now? And maybe I'll just leave it open. I wonder if you think both. Do you agree? Is there hope? And then what needs to happen to realize the hope?
Cecilia?
That's a very good and difficult question, obviously, because there will be changes not only in Europe, but globally in labor markets. I mean, this is always happening, but it's happening at a much greater pace right now, and we don't really know what would be the jobs of tomorrow. So obviously, the European Union needs to take seriously the criticisms and the concerns of lack of innovation and lack of investments. I agree with Sarah that big, massive state investments might not be the conclusions, but we need to think broader on this, and we need to invest massively in skills of the people as well, because they need to be able to, in Europe, we don't move to the jobs like you do in the US. So people are much more stationary, and that of course leads to gigantic effects when suddenly the big factory needs to close. So a massive investment in skills, in lifelong learning, and so on needs to come together with this. I think also that trade, as Adam said, and of course this is also part of, when you talk about strategic autonomy, we often forget the third word. It's open strategic autonomy. Many countries forget the open. Other countries, like the one I come from, Sweden, we tend to over-focus the open. And as always, when we talk about the European Union, it's about labeling and catchy phrases in order so everybody will go from the meeting happy. But openness is actually about trade. It's in the treaty of the European Union that we should promote trade and open markets. And that creates jobs. And we know that trade has created millions and millions and millions of jobs in the European Union, and that those jobs are actually more qualified and better paid than the average jobs. So continuing that, working with more trading partners, we have Mercosur, we have an agreement with Mexico that is not done, we have a half agreement with Australia, and we should absolutely, as European Union, join the CPTPP countries, because that is where the dynamic is. There's a lot of protectionism and inward looking and navel gazing in Europe and in the US right now, but there's much more dynamism in that part of the world. We should be there where it happens. And that, I think, together with lots of other things can create more jobs and help smooth the effects of the labor market. But it's not going to be easy, and some of these transitions are going to be very, very painful. But they will happen.
And
anyway.
I guess I would be less concerned about creation of jobs and more concerned about whether there's a mechanism for people to move out of the jobs that will be diminished and move into the new ones.
There's also the social, I mean, Europe has, most countries has also a social policy, where you don't just end on the street when you're unemployed. There are social benefits and so on. But they have to be transformed. And some countries have very successfully tried to do this. In Denmark and Netherlands, for instance, use to to use that money during the transition period to really seek to reskill or to develop your capacities so that you are able to take other kinds of jobs.
Maybe part of the reason I'm asking is because a piece of work that we've done, which grounds an assumption that like the economy won't shift, and we just look at that what jobs are automatable, and also what jobs might grow on the basis of trends of e-commerce, of aging populations, healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. And if you look at jobs likely created and jobs likely lost, there's a lot wrong with that, right? But just to get a sense, the number of occupational transitions that would be required in Europe, as in the US actually, but in Europe is roughly twice what the rate of job transition has been over the past 10 or 15 years, versus in Europe it's about similar to what pre-COVID job transitions
US,
were.
you mean?
In the US it's about similar. In Europe, what would be required is about 2 times what it was previously, and so it's that dynamism I'm asking about. Yeah.
I think we are on a long way to an uniformization of labor rules in the EU. And I think members are going to face differently the technical change, substitution, labor versus capital and AI. So that will be difficult to go towards a single labor market. But I think there is a path referring to the previous question, there's a path to improve on the tax union. So it's not, you say fiscal, but I mean, I guess you meant tax union, kind of being capable of uniformizing tax base, for instance. There is a project of having a common tax base at the EU level, and maybe it could happen faster than we can expect, and that will be important to also to give a level playing field across companies, and also a good step to increase the degree of single market. So that is a project, I think. I don't know, Cecilia, what do you think about this project of the common base, tax base for business taxes? But I think it's a project that could finally end up.
Can I just add, Olivia wasn't identified. She's from McKinsey Global Institute, so when she refers to the studies they've done, you can find them there. I'm going to say something that sounds negative, but is actually optimistic. Let's not forget that European small d democratic politics and social stability has survived decades of mass unemployment in a number of countries. It survived Spain, it survived Greece after the crisis, it survived southern Italy, Ireland. I mean, it's not to say I don't care about that and I don't want there to be better responses, but just to say, and maybe this goes back to very fundamental things about the social welfare state or the sense of unity or whatever it is, it's not, even displacing lots of people from their current work is not a political death sentence. It's not even an economic death sentence. So I just want to emphasize, we should worry about it if we can figure out affordable mechanisms like the whatever it's called in active labor market policies in Denmark and get them to work, great. But I don't think we should get quite as upset as sometimes people do, because Europe has been through some very large labor force dislocations, and it's been okay.
It had a high price, but Greece...
No, but again, but that's why I said it sounds like it's positive. It had a high price, and I, as you know, among many others, were fighting to not have that happen. But the bottom line is, you had unemployment go up the way it did during COVID in the US for much longer in multiple countries, and the rise of the right wing or the rise of political violence was limited. Peter disagrees.
Greece and Spain are actually the 2 countries who are doing the best in Europe right now, economically.
I think the issue might be elsewhere, though. It's like, even if that's not, there have to be new jobs created with people able to step into them and do them in a trained way. And I think actually now, because I think there are some demographic issues together with just current tight labor markets that at least in many European countries might be the challenge.
Except
But
labor
then-
force participation has been steadily rising in Europe for the last several years. It's been flat to slight recovery in the U.S. Female labor force participation is higher in Europe than in the U.S. now. So again, the story is the geographic labor market mobility in the U.S. has been declining. Europe, it's been flat. Yes, check the census data. Okay, sorry. So
Karl.
Your advice to the Europeans not to follow the American game in some areas makes a great deal of sense. Of course, particularly you said focus on integration and on the strength. And there are some, for example, face those parts of the common market which do not yet function properly, all of that. But can one imagine politically that it is possible not to react to strong industrial policy and subsidies from the American partner, to prohibitive, very strong duties that will be raised if, for example, a Trump administration? It's also a question to the former commissioner. I mean, the pressure from Europe, quite apart from the fact that the Europeans have a residual attachment to the WTO rules, is that manageable? Can the Europeans not react? I don't see that.
Thank you, Carl. Let me give a brief answer, and Cecilia, who's actually been the European politician, can give a more realistic answer. I would separate reacting to trade conflict from reacting to industrial policy and subsidies.
Yeah.
So trade conflict, yeah. If Trump puts on across-the-board tariffs and tries to negotiate bilaterally deals with individual EU members, starting with Meloni's Italy and Orban's Hungary, the European Union should whack the US upside the head with complete retaliation. I advocated retaliation against Trump back in 2017. So that's fine. What I'm trying to, and that will be what it'll be. What I'm trying to argue is the industrial policy subsidies, the Made in America emulation, things like that. It may be unrealistic, but your alternative is you spend billions and billions and billions of euros, you fight amongst yourselves. Why is it all the state aid is going to France and Germany? I need my set aside in this country. And you end up at the end unable to compete, and you've foregone other options. So I can totally see why politicians would react on tit for tat, but I think it's a mistake. It's just full on a mistake in a very obvious way.
Well, if Trump is elected next week and he pursues with his tariffs, I think the European Union is preparing retaliation, as we did last time, starting with golf balls maybe, or something that will hurt. But joke aside, we did that last time. They are kept in. They have been suspended right now, but they actually the suspension of these tariffs expires in the beginning of next year, because Biden hasn't taken away the steel and aluminium tariff. They have been transformed to quotas, but they are still there, and they hurt European companies a lot. So we'll see what happens there. But realistically, Europe cannot provide as much state aid as the US has. We cannot. We don't have those resources. Of course, there will have to be more investments in innovation and in the green transition. And that's what the whole discussion right now is about. Where do you find that money? In the budget, there will have to be an increased contribution from member states to the common budget. That is indispensable, will have to happen also with the upcoming enlargement. There will have to be new innovative ways of seeking public partnership with private organizations as well. This is happening right now. There are lots of initiatives going on there. There will have to be a greater expenditure by and lending procedures by the European Investment Bank, both when it comes to defense and in the green transition. But totally live up to what the US is doing is not realistic. So there will have to be a different policy. But the demands are very, very high, especially from some countries, and there is huge disagreement on how to solve this. And Sarah can confirm this. There are different views within the 27, and somehow it will have to land in a common budget. And we cannot allow too much an erosion of the state aid routes. They've already been eroded under COVID. But if we do that, 70% of all the state aid today is done by Germany and France. And we have an internal market. And if you loosen all the rules up, the internal market will dissolve. Because Portugal, Slovenia, Denmark, Slovakia, and others, they don't have as deep pockets as France and Germany. So there has to be some discipline. And that will be a huge challenge the coming years.
Peter.
I have a question for Adam, but before I ask it, I want to make common cause with Olivia on the issue of job displacement and the like. I'm delighted to hear Adam be optimistic for once, but yes, Europe has survived mass unemployment before in multiple cases. I think you're entirely right about that, but I think there is a political vehicle currently for the discontent that this regional unemployment and occupational change currently generates. My discipline, I think, has shown pretty well that it's actually not so much people's immediate adverse economic experiences, but rather their fears about what automation or what globalization will do to their jobs that inclines them to vote for populist right parties. And I think that, in a sense, that gives a kind of political vehicle for the concerns that we didn't see, for instance, in the early 1980s, when Europe again had relatively high unemployment. And so, but Adam, I just wanted to probe I agreed with almost everything you said. I learned a lot from it. I wanted to probe the limits of your sort of views about strategic autonomy. I agree with you that Europe should import, and so should the US, Chinese solar panels, et cetera. I think that's absolutely right. How far would you go, though? Do you not think Europe should diversify its supply chains? And when it comes to some particularly critical high-tech goods like advanced silicon chips and the like, do you not think that there might be a justification for, European state action, European subsidies? And when it comes to trade and free flows, would they not stop maybe at the Russian border? How does Russia fit into that? So I just wondered, what are the limits of what I think is basically a position I agree with, certainly, that you're taking there.
Thank you, Peter. Very gracious and clear. And yes, just on your first point, agreed that there is a political vehicle for expression of the discontent. I read a lot of not you personally, obviously I do, but I mean your profession's take on this, and I agree that it's much more about fears and emotions and images than about direct economic effects. And that makes me slightly more sanguine, because I think it has a lot more to do with migration and things like that. But anyway, point well taken. In terms of the limits of strategic autonomy, so there actually, and Ben probably knows this, there's a couple Harvard economics students who have a job market paper that just came out about trying to measure in a rigorous way dual-use technologies. How much is you're trying to formalize somehow the trade-off between how central is this technology to military use versus how much downstream does it get used by other economic, anyway. So, I mean, and the reason I was in Berlin 2 weeks ago is because CEPR, the European version of NBER, actually has a better program than NBR now of trying to commission papers on these issues and things. So there is a real issue there. But let's stipulate that within some finite amount of time, these brilliant minds will come up with better ways of defining and measuring using input-output tables and trade elasticities. The broader question, I know that isn't what you meant. The broader question is, where do you draw the line in terms of partners? Where do you draw the line in terms of high tech and so on? I think the answer is twofold. First, the key word which you mentioned, I think, is diversification. And what we've moved to is a world, and Jeff Frankel was talking about this earlier at a workshop, even though it was off the record. I don't think he'd mind if I said that. But the key point is we've moved to a world where it's assumed foreign is more harmful than domestic, as opposed to diversification is what you need. Because I'm worried about some white terrorist in Oklahoma, or God forbid, another state, you know, blowing up something important, or, you know, moral hazard of too big to fail Boeing or a US chip maker or something leads to corruption, and so we're end up like the Russian army, that we have equipment that ends up being no good when it's time for war because we've so favored our domestic procurement process. I mean, again, you know all this, but I just want to stress, I think we need to change the frame that resilience is out of diversification, not out of reducing foreign connections. And, you know, Alan Beatty writes very articulately in the FT about, like, food security, how for most countries, you're never going to be self-sufficient in food if you're not the US, and you need diversification. So that's the first point. The second point is, obviously, there has to be some kind of process where you say, I literally do not want the Chinese or the Russians to have this specific technology, military technology. But even there, it doesn't work, right? As our mutual colleague, Larry Summers, well, he's my vice chair of my board, so I guess I shouldn't call him a colleague. But as Larry Summers points out, right, the atomic bomb was the most guarded secret in the world, and yet somehow, you know, a bunch of other countries, starting with the Soviet Union, got the plans, and then they got the plans for the H-bomb. And, you know, the idea that we're going to do much more than throw sand in the gears, I think is mistaken. And so, in a sense, the strategic autonomy has to be achieved through not just the second word besides diversification is innovation. It has to be achieved by creating things that the other people don't have, and it's not because they can't get the blueprint, it's because you actually can make something your institutions, your military is capable of using it. I mean, so again, I'm not suggesting there's no gradient in military technology, right? It really mattered a lot. Let's talk about Israel, not today, but 30, 40 years ago, it really mattered a lot that they had top-end planes, first from France and then from the US, that were far more capable than what the Egyptians were flying. So, I mean, military tech does matter, but that's not the result of one component or something. That's the result of having a weapons system and training and all these things. So to me, I'm trying to push back, and this is something I spent a lot of time on in Washington to very little avail, is trying to push back on this sort of mental frame that a lot of policymakers have in Washington, and I fear under strategic autonomy heading in Europe, that it's about control of these precious, specific little technologies and domestic production of these specific little technologies, and that's not really the point. And the final thing I would say is, again, maybe this is foolish of me, but, you know, we talked about this a little bit earlier. Take Germany, right? So Germany, yes, they were dependent on Russia for energy, and this was not good in a lot of ways. But Germany had a very good two-decade run that enabled it to remain a democracy while assimilating Eastern Germany, getting convergence in living standards, contributing to the Western Alliance, And so if you want to evaluate cost-benefit, you have to also say, okay, yeah, there may be a kill switch the Chinese put in here, or the Russians someday will cut off the energy, but you know, you got to take sort of the interval of the preceding 20 years and say, okay, what would we have foregone? So anyway, I'm not giving you a very specific answer, but it's more because I'm just pushing back. I think if strategic autonomy, or even better, as Cecilia rightly says, open strategic autonomy, is conceived of as Europe saying we don't want to be wholly dependent on the US for our foreign policy. Okay, I like that.
I have three of you on my list, and I want to close this list. Is anybody else interested in coming in? So I was,
Same time?
no. And then we would have some sort of concluding remarks around the table. You are on the list, and since I've been misbehaving and was very unfriendly to my friend Stefan. Stefan, you're the
So Adam, if I understand you rightly, you say, well, Europe has all these values that we like and preserve them. And when I was young and innocent, I thought America was the bright city on the hill, and it had all those values of openness and freedom and all that. Where has it gone? And why do you think Europe would preserve that? Usually we follow the US development with a delay of 10 years. And I see absolutely zero reason why we wouldn't fall in exactly the same trap that America has gone into. So the point I'm making is like, what you're saying is rationally totally right. I totally agree with you. I think it's beautiful. And I think the politics are the opposite of it. And I mean, also your optimism, you say, well, we have survived many crises. That's true. I've been sick a few times and I have survived, but I know one day I'll die. This is there's no guarantee that because you have done it in the past, you will do it in the future. And we have now Hungary, Slovakia, Italy, France, Netherlands, Germany nearly, Sweden nearly. I mean, come on. I mean, this is the reality of Europe. And you say, well, Europe should do that. I don't even know who Europe is who should act. There is no one who acts.
I think, Stefan, you are being cheaply cynical in the following 2 or 3 senses. The first point is, I don't say Europe should pursue this strategy because I'm certain it's going to work. I'm saying Europe should pursue this strategy because I think it's your best shot, and because I am quite certain that Europe attempting to follow the US and China will not work. So I'm sorry I put a too optimistic spin on it, but that's really the reality here. If you're between a rock and a hard place, you have to decide. And I'm suggesting that you may not win, you may get bombed or something terrible, but you have to at least try to figure out what's the best strategy. That's the first point. So I think I'm actually being more realistic than you. The second point is on the politics. This goes back to the labor and Peter's caution, Olivia, and things I and others have been fighting about, in which, to the degree we all, I see Meg Hogan in the background, she contributed to the Peterson Institute work on this, particularly in the area of migration. We're all trying to make sense of the rightward swing in Europe, in democracies of the West, in the US, in a world where it's overdetermined, and at the same time, the economics has actually been pretty good. And so the way I approach this, that of course I can't prove, but I have to talk about, is I think what we're about to see demonstrated in this election is that you cannot buy off the displaced, overcompensated white male, okay? That the people whose relative status has been eroded by a combination of justice and technology are very angry because they've lost status, relative status. And we cannot buy them off. So we have to defeat them at the ballot box, in the market, in the battleground of ideas. The Biden administration believes that with targeted industrial programs in this congressional district and that congressional district, they will buy it off. I think that's gonna, God willing, it will prove irrelevant to the outcome of the election, but I'm quite certain that if Harris wins, it's not gonna be because of that. So these people are entitled to have their views, and they're entitled to vote, and they're entitled to complain, everything short of political violence, and they're entitled to have a right-wing party. They can do all the things they're doing. I mean, I'm not denying them their rights, and they can be as angry as they like. But if you take it as given that there is some percentage of all of our polities who are inclined that way, you try to figure out ways to foil them. You have laws like you do in Germany that restrict certain kinds of parties. You have coalition governments as opposed to first-past-the-post majoritarian presidential systems like in the US. Again, I'm getting into political science, things others can talk about. But, you know, in the end, I don't understand the response that this is politically unrealistic. Fine, it's politically unrealistic, but they don't have an agenda that's going to help anybody. So you have to offer an alternative and hope that you can win a majority somehow. That's all you got. So I mean, again, I'm sort of doing a different version of what I said to you previously. It's not necessarily you and I are that disagreed on the facts, although I think we are a little. It's more that, given the facts, you have to play the hand you're dealt.
I collect the last two questions. It is you and Sofia Perez. So
I also wanted to bring in the foreign policy dimension, but I think it's been alluded to thoroughly. But thank you.
Thank you. Sophia?
Yes. So I wanted to make two observations. One is sort of along the lines of Peter Hall's earlier. The one thing I'm hearing you say, and I completely understand the position of, you know, we have this incredible prospect here of possibly Trump winning, right? What should the Europeans do? And if, you know, let's do this, and then let's cross this bridge if we get there, if, you know, if once we've seen what the fallout is in the US. But on the other hand, I'm also seeing sort of change on the ground that is not only in the US, but also in Europe. And one of the ways that you see it is that the party systems that existed up until the great financial crisis have completely changed across European countries. And so that tells you that there's a political reality there that may make anything that has to do with a European response very difficult. And then just, I know we want to finish here, but I did want to go back to to Cecilia Malmström's point on what the resources are and what the objective is, which is to worry about European defense, you know, autonomously somehow. But this brings me to something, which is that when you see the EU having gone through real reform it is usually when there has been a threat to human security. And of course, the most obvious threat to human security, aside from, the idea of many migrants coming, is war. And so I wonder if, just like COVID, which was a threat to human security, made it possible to change something about Europe's macroeconomic governance with the issuing of common debt, for instance. If, say, Trump comes to power and there's a trade war and the EU has to retaliate, would that not be a moment grabbing onto this idea that we need our own defense because the future of NATO is completely up in the air in that situation, to make a case for further fiscal integration?
Let's use that as some of the thread of the few final comments. Adam?
No, let me yield time to my two colleagues.
So,
You want to answer?
yes.
Yeah, I wanted to comment all the questions.
Yeah.
Can I do that? Yes, thank you so much. So much flying out there. The EU is a community of values, and that's, that is why we have the European Union. And then, of course, it's economic cooperation and it's integration and all that, but it is a community of value. Now that is eroding. I think even Europe started before Trump, and we do have Trumpists or Trump-liked people in the European Union, and that is a problem. Democracy is eroding globally. We have fewer democracies today than we had 25 years ago globally, and that is a huge challenge. And we have weak political leadership in many countries as well. I've been in politics for 35 years. I can see the situation. What do? Well, you try to change it. That's the only thing. You say, okay, that's how it is. Let's fight it. Let's unite the good forces and let's come up with other proposals. Let's give those populists from the right to the left a good challenge. And this is what is not really there today. There's very weak political leadership in European Union and in other countries as well. And that concerns me a lot. The European Union has a lot to do independently who sits in the White House. We have a whole list of homework for preparing for enlargement, for helping Ukraine to win, to do the innovation and a better coordinated European defense. And the list is very long. And we need to do that, whoever wins on Tuesday. Of course, then we need to see how can we cooperate with the United States. It's United States and Europe are friends. We are allies forever. The transatlantic bond is very, very strong. In some areas, it will be easier with the Harris administration and more difficult with the Trump administration. But you need to try to define where can we work with the Trump administration as well, because of course there has to be cooperation. But there's something obsessive about this election. Europe will still be there, and we need to do what we need to do, whoever runs the American country. On defense, yes, I agree with you, and that maybe I didn't make the point clear enough, that this is an existential moment. Actually, Europe has stepped up immensely after COVID, what it did, and also with the defense and the support and the sanctions to Ukraine. It's not enough. We need to do more. But in only 3 days, there was first sanction package rolled out. And there's been 15 of them, but closely coordinated with the US and other allies. Some have been coordinated, some are just European. That's quite a change. And it has taken a lot of steps as well. A fiscal union, a capital market union would be ideal. I think it's going to be slow, but we can take small steps in that direction by showing results. We don't have to call it, we don't have to label it, but we can take those small steps. And I think that will happen. But it's not going to be an independent European defense. It will have to be within NATO. US is a very important player in NATO, but there are a few other countries there as well who are not Europeans, but who are also very committed to NATO. There's UK, there's Canada, and Norway, for instance.
And Turkey.
And Turkey, yes, of course, another flourishing democracy. So yes, I think it will happen, but I see the lack of political leadership in Europe as well. So the big grandiose reforms will not be there, but small steps towards improvement, absolutely.
Why do we have that lack?
Because voters vote for other. We can talk that a bit.
Sarah?
Yeah, we have this lack of leadership everywhere in the world. We have populism everywhere in the world, not only in the EU, not only in the US. And but I think this concept of autonomy, this concept of self-sufficiency are completely empty. That we are going to live in a world that it would be much more interdependent in terms of flows of goods, flows of ideas, flows of services, and flows of people. Think about this problem of migration. So we are going to enter a world with much more interdependencies. The fragmentation is not going to stop. It's going to be much more important because of what? Because of this need of critical materials that are not everywhere in the world, so we need to trade. If we want to do the ecological transition, we will have to trade critical materials. Because the content in technology means that the fragmentation is in every object. Every Internet of object will contain the chips, and the chips is a super fragmented value chain. So anytime you have a chips, you have a global value chain. So more and more, we are going to live in a world that is super fragmented, at least the production, and we have to deal with that. So it won't be easy, but the reality of trade will be this one. And it will not disappear, even if we shorten the value chain. Even if we change the trade, we do not trade directly with China, but with Vietnam, with another Asian country. But everywhere we will have to diversify, and if we diversify, we fragment more. So fragmentation is going to be our future. Interdependency is going to be our future. So we have to think about a governance for that, maybe another international governance to think about these interdependencies. And but the EU is not going to save the US. So next big problem of the US is not going to be saved by this. It's quite provocative, but I think the EU is not going to save the US. And I'm not sure that we are following the US 10 years lag. It used to be the case, but I'm not sure that we can look at social performance and health performance and so on. The EU has its own path, its own community of values, and probably we believe, of course, in these values, and it will be the proportion of people believing in this community of values that will make the future of Europe as well. So we have to believe in a different path for the EU. And last, to finish, I want to say that, of course, as we say in France, the worst is never certain. Le pire n'est jamais sûr.
Sounds better in French.
The worst is never certain. By the way, Next Generation EU was a rather rapid response to a terrible crisis. In today's terms, about 800 billion. And what was remarkable about that was not the 800 billion, but half of it, almost half of it, it was a grant, a gift. So, and the other half was debt funded. So half of it was a gift from the richer Europeans to the poorer Europeans. Sophia. And it was it was actually started and launched. I want to end positively. Come on. It was conceived by the German finance ministry and the French finance ministry. We actually had the two people here. And it was quite strongly fought against by some Nordics. They dubbed themselves frugals. But it managed to, for instance, and that's really remarkable, for instance, to distribute vaccines, which were at the moment very scarce, not dependent on per capita income, but on age. So any Romanian 70 years old was ahead in the queue of any German 25 years old, 5 times as rich. So that was European solidarity. And I guess Europe can somehow get its act together. I'm really frustrated about one point, actually. I had asked my co-chair, Adam, to talk about Schuldenbremse.
I'm going to the airport. I can't talk about it. You'll have to have me back.
So boring.
You'll have to have me back.
So that is about, there is fiscal capacity potentially in Europe, and some Europeans don't want to use it. Okay, I hope it was somehow enlightening for you, and you liked it as much as I did. So thank you very much for coming and for thinking about your society.